So starting us off in panel 2 is Amal Rizvi. She's a fourth-year undergraduate student currently enrolled in the Honors Biology program under Western University's Faculty of Science. She's passionate about the intersection between environmental systems with human and animal health. And so here she is with the impact of COVID-19 on ocean acidification and what this means for humans. Take it away, Amal.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Amal, and it's a pleasure to be presenting and listening and learning at this conference for the second year. Today, I'm going to be talking about how reductions in carbon dioxide emissions during the COVID-19 pandemic influenced our aquatic ecosystems through ocean acidification. So just as a brief overview, we're going to start off with an introduction where we're going to define some key terms and talk about emission trends. Then we're going to get right into the ocean, talk about how the pandemic and the change in carbon emissions actually impacted our oceans, and then conclude with some ecosystem effects, aka how were organisms affected by changes to our oceans. Starting off, we're going to define two really important terms. The first one being the anthropogenic greenhouse effect. So this is the gradual incessant warming of the Earth's surface due to human-related greenhouse gas emissions, which includes land use change and fossil fuel burning, though fossil fuel burning is the main concern. And the second main concern when it comes to ocean health and carbon emissions in general is ocean acidification. So this is the decrease of ocean pH due to increased pressure on our oceans to absorb anthropogenic atmospheric carbon that we put out. So there's a lot of chemistry behind this that I'm not really going to get into, but basically how it works is that the more emissions that we put out, the more pressure there is on our oceans to take all that carbon in, and that causes a net increase in protons in the ocean and makes them a lot more acidic. All right, so getting right into the emission trends, a temporary 7 to 8% reduction in global CO2 emissions was observed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the reason I say this is temporary is because, first of all, we have to understand that this was a forced reduction due to lockdown measures that reduced consumption, industrial output, and transportation. And it's likely not going to be permanent. The reason for this is that in CO2 emissions have been historically pretty short-lived due to post-crisis rebounds that ultimately restore original production rates. This was actually evident during the 2009 global financial crisis, in which global emissions actually declined by 1.4% in 2009, but then increased by 5.1% the following year. And the COVID-19 pandemic is likely no exception to this general trend. Despite the reduction in emissions, there's actually been no detectable slowing of ocean acidification, according to data presented at the American Geophysical Union in fall 2020. Even if we reduced emissions at the rate of 4 times that we reduced during the pandemic, it would really not result in a significantly more positive ocean pH. So now, getting into the ocean impact, again, there are two main things I want to touch on briefly. The first one being water turbidity and fish density. So, according to water quality assessments in the Gulf of Mannar, which is a shallow bay in the Indian Ocean, there was a net improvement. So, when post and pre-lockdown data were compared, there was an evident net decrease in water turbidity. So, water turbidity, for those of you who don't know, is cloudiness and is an indicator of pollutants in the water. So decreased water turbidity directly reflects the industrial shutdown and the decreased release of inorganic ionized industrial waste. Second of all, the Gulf of Mannar also exhibited an increase in fish density, which likely correlates with the absence of destructive fishing measures during the pandemic, like trap fishing. The next thing I want to talk about is chlorophyll A levels actually decreased during the pandemic. So chlorophyll A is a photosynthetic pigment that is actually used as a proxy for aquatic ecosystem health. And the 7 to 8% drop in global CO2 emissions that I just talked about is actually correlated with a decrease in chlorophyll A in areas like Alaska, North Europe, South China, and the southeastern US. For example, after a 5% after a 123-ton decrease in emissions in China, this was correlated with a 5% drop in chlorophyll A. So, getting into the ecosystem effects, why exactly did that chlorophyll? So, this can be a bit confusing, but I'm going to try to break it down. Basically, chlorophyll A, as I mentioned before, is a proxy for primary productivity. And primary productivity decreases when algal biomass or phytoplankton biomass decreases because echinoderm biomass increases. So echinoderms are organisms, stars, sand dollars, and sea urchins, basically calcium organisms that make those hard calcium shells. And basically, normally, when water pH decreases as oceans acidify, the arms of the Pluteus larvae of echinoderms actually decrease in size, therefore decreasing their survivability and recruitment to adults. However, because ocean pH actually technically would have increased, although not significantly, but that's kind of the theory, this decrease in survivability would actually not happen as much. And that's why we'd have more echinoderm biomass, less algal biomass, and less primary productivity. There would be less algal biomass because sea urchins and other echinoderms actually scrape algae off the rocks to obtain calcium carbonate, which they use to develop their hard protective shells. So, to summarize, I know that was a little bit difficult because there's a lot of chain reactions going on, but basically, when the pandemic decreased emissions, we actually ended up decreasing primary productivity because echinoderm biomass increased, and this would overall decrease chlorophyll A levels. The second effect that I want to talk about is how fish biomass actually increased, as I talked about in the Gulf of Mannar, as well as other parts of the world. So, obviously, we did touch on how during the pandemic, there was just a lot less going on in the world, and we had a decrease in destructive fishing measures. However, we can also explain this increased fish biomass by reduced echinoderm biomass. So, echinoderms like sea urchins, sea stars, and whatnot also consume kelp. Kelp are critical habitats to many fish species. Kelp are really big, they're really dense, and a lot of fish can hide out and avoid predators in them. So, if we actually have decreased echinoderm recruitment, will actually result in greater kelp densities, and we'd have more habitats for fish and increased fish biomass. Something I also want to touch on, though, with the increased kelp densities is that increased kelp densities can actually have an adverse on coral reef associated fish. So, in a series of controlled patch experiments in Fiji, coral associated butterfly fish actually avoid corals that have been associated with seaweed. So, why is this? It's because kelp and other seaweed produce chemical cues when they grow around corals, and these cues persist even after the seaweed has been removed. So, essentially, kelp and corals are not only in direct competition with each other, but there's this chemical cue going on that can really affect the association of certain fish species. It's also important to realize that because kelp grows a lot faster than coral, and coral and kelp are in competition with each other, increased kelp densities can very easily disrupt reef ecosystems. All right, so I hope that wasn't too much to explain in a short amount of time, but essentially, some concluding notes I want to talk about is that so although most things suggest that there have not really been uh, although most findings suggest that there have not really been significant negative effects in relation to COVID-19 ecosystems, it's important to note that there are really no current systems in place to monitor global CO2 emissions in real time because these emissions are reported annually and the data is not usually released until much later. So there remains a severe lack of information actually in regards to how COVID-19 affected aquatic ecosystems, and this gap will likely remain until well after the end of the pandemic. Second of all, ocean acidification remains a pressing concern with or without the pandemic. And although I'm sure we all know that the reduction of emissions is the single most effective method in mitigating ocean acidification, the current trajectory of major industries suggests that this might not be the most desirable solution. And so, geoengineering approaches have been explored a little bit to assist in reducing the negative impacts of the ever increasing fossil fuel emissions. So, geoengineering, to quickly summarize, is the deliberate large scale intervention in Earth's natural systems. Mechanism that we've been trying out has been iron fertilization, which, in short, has been just dumping a huge amount of iron into low chlorophyll regions in the ocean to increase primary productivity. So, although this sounds like a great idea in theory, it's actually very costly and it can pose its own risk, and it might really not be as effective as we need it to be to save our oceans. Um, Lastly, it's important to realize that while ocean acidification is a key driver in aquatic ecosystem health, it is nowhere near the only factor. And there are tons of other aspects of ocean health, such as terrestrial runoff, ocean upwelling, brownification, and water temperature, that future studies really do need to examine in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic to really draw strong conclusions about how our oceans and our aquatic organisms were affected during the pandemic and what the cascading effects of this are going to be through higher trophic levels, including up to humans. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. That was wonderful. So we'll open up to questions. There's one in there right now. So Zach, did you want to speak to your question?
Sure, yeah, I'll ask it. So this one was to Amal. Um, are there technological solutions to ocean acidity that we discovered amidst the pandemic, or have we found that reducing production would be the best bet? Or is there an alternative that I haven't thought of that you discovered in your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's actually the topic of a very common topic of debate among people who study these things. So, unfortunately, reduced production and fossil fuel reduction is probably going to be our best bet, just because the amount of fossil fuels that these big corporations and just us in general, like when we're driving and whatnot, that we release every single day is disproportionately larger than the effects of any technological solution that has been proposed thus far. There have been, as I mentioned, some geoengineering approaches. They haven't been looked at as much during the pandemic, mainly because during the pandemic, so the main environmental concern is always ends up being global warming, and acidification of oceans always tends to come second, with global warming always coming first, and that's understandable because obviously global warming, we do live and breathe our atmosphere, and oceans do kind of come second when it comes to our human needs. However, oceans are a giant buffer for climate change and warming, so we definitely do have to start looking into these technological solutions that you've proposed or that you've suggested, because it's just a matter of how long that buffer is going to last. And one solution that we did look at during the pandemic that's not exactly a technological solution, but more of an ecological one, has been increasing the density of underwater vegetation like kelp and other underwater plants. Because, as some of you might know, on land, when we have plants like trees and plants and whatnot, they absorb carbon dioxide. So they're a very big way that we do reduce our CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we could kind of mimic that underwater, that is a potential solution. It is definitely going to be difficult and costly, and there's a lot of unknowns at play as to how we're going to even get all these plants in the ocean, how they're going to survive, and all that. But so far, just increasing vegetation and reducing fossil fuel emissions has been the number one um, solution thus far to lowering ocean acidity.
Thank you. That's a great answer. You also answered my follow up, which was whether or not vegetation or an ecological solution, as you had suggested, would be viable. Um, so it'll be exciting to see the future research that comes out on what exactly will be our most efficient and cost effective solutions for these ecological and technical ways of reducing acidity.
Yeah, for sure.
Our next question is from Colton to Amal. What are the main negative effects from the iron dumping solution?
Yeah, that's a also a really good question. So basically, the way this iron fertilization approach, so basically the science behind the iron fertilization approach is basically it stimulates phytoplankton growth because we're dumping all this iron into very high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions of the ocean where normally phytoplankton growth would be minimal. So, phytoplankton actually need iron to increase primary productivity. So, if we increase the phytoplankton abundance in these areas, it'll result in their increased uptake of atmospheric CO2. And then eventually, all these dead phytoplankton, when they die, are going to sink to the deep ocean and sequester all that CO2 there. So, they're kind of contributing to that buffer. So, the problem with this, number one, is that it's extremely expensive because you need basically how this works that there's these giant boats and it's a tank of iron and they're dropping all that iron into these specific regions of the world. So just all that equipment and machinery is extremely expensive and costly. And the second concern is that this has been tried before. And although it does work and it does produce the theoretical results, it really isn't as large scale as we really need it to be because with all of the damage that has been done and all of the emissions that are put out every single day and every single year, unfortunately, the iron dumping approach really doesn't even make a dent in the damage that we've already done. So that's kind of another reason people sort of shy away from it is that people think, well, it's really, really expensive and it works, but barely. So is it really worth it? And there's also the other problem is that you're dumping all of this iron, which iron doesn't naturally exist in these areas. These are low chlorophyll regions. So there's not a lot of iron here already. So the cascading effects of introducing this foreign iron into this ecosystem is still relatively understudied, and we don't really know what's going to happen to the organisms that do live in this area, such and with large predators, small prey, and whatnot. So it's just a very new approach right now that unfortunately we don't see a lot of benefits for, and it could in the long run do more harm than good. But there is a lot of research being done on this, so we'll see where we go with it in the next couple of years.
Wow, that was very informative. Thank you.